Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about a lady who, just quite frankly, I found absolutely fascinating, Chris, in the research for this episode, and that's Ida Tarbell, one of the muckraker journalists of the late 19th and early 20th century. I found her to be an absolutely fascinating individual to research.
Absolutely, and I think in today's society, we're talking about individuals who are willing to step up and stand up and speak up for things that they believe passionately about. And Ida Tarbell, if it had not been for her rigid determination and exhaustive studying of a particular life, I don't think we would have heard about her. But because she was willing to go against the grain and to challenge one of the most notorious, wealthiest individuals of American time, John D. Rockefeller Sr. So John D. Rockefeller, who is this individual who understood self-reliance, self-improvement, will be one of the richest men in America, who has determination to create a very powerful monopoly. And so it's just a fascinating story of how Ida Tarbell is able to, find him out to be who he really is.
Yeah, and you mentioned the story of David and Goliath, and I think that's a very good metaphor for what is going on here between Ida Tarbell and John Rockefeller. Because when you think about Tarbell, you don't think about a big city person who's involved in big oil dealings and stuff like that. And in fact, she was not. Let's think about a little bit about her background for a moment. Ida was born in November of 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania. Her father was a small-time oil man. He was not a big oil tycoon or anything like that. She had a good family life, but I do find it interesting, Chris, that she actually grew up in a log cabin. One of the most popular presidential campaign slogans of the 19th century was "Tip a canoe and Tyler too." William Henry Harrison, the idea that he grew up in a log cabin, which he really didn't. But this log cabin for a long time in American history was seen as sort of the epitome of the average person. And here's a woman who indeed did grow up in a log cabin, but she had a good childhood. She did very well in school. And she leaves school and she gets a bachelor's degree from Allegheny College in 1880. She's going to become a staff member of a local newspaper, and eventually she's going to move up to its managing editor. She's going to spend time in Paris, studying there at the University of Paris for about 2 years from 1891 to 1894. She's going to write magazine articles. And then from 1894 to 1896, which is really the period in which we're going to be looking at her at, she's going to be employed by McClure's magazine here in the United States. And she's going to become an associate editor of American Magazine, and she's going to be there until 1915. And Chris, when we think about Ida Tarbell, we don't just want to think about Ida the muckraker or Ida the journalist. There was also Ida the biographer and Ida the historian. She wrote a number of very important books, not just simply on the Standard Oil, which we're going to be talking about today, but she wrote a biography of Abraham Lincoln. And I checked, by the way, just in case our listeners are interested, that is for sale on Amazon.com. She wrote a book on Napoleon Bonaparte, on Judge Elbert Gary. She wrote a number of very important works that are still in publication today. And of course, the one that we're going to be focusing on today is her work in 1904, the 2-volume history of the Standard Oil Company. And the Standard Oil Company, Chris, is John D. Rockefeller. And that's that big oil monopoly that I'm sure you tell your students in class about that particular company as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that the most important thing that we can take away from Ida Tarbell and how this history actually develops is that Ida Tarbell was a young woman who was betrayed. And she's betrayed not by some lover, but by John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And how it would basically crush her dreams and crush her early life. You mentioned that she was born in a log cabin, but thanks to the hard work of her father, they enjoyed life.
Yep.
Life was actually good. She actually wrote, she said there was ease, such as we had never known, luxuries we had never heard of. Life was good. And then all of a sudden she says that her family and the town that she was from was dealt a blow between the eyes. And that basically, we kind of got to go back some to when she was 14 years of age, and she experienced something that was known as the Cleveland Massacre. And the Cleveland Massacre basically is when you have dozens of small oil producers that were found in Ohio and also in the western part of Pennsylvania were faced with a choice. And the choice was this: you could sell your business to the confident, self-motivated 32-year-old John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his newly incorporated company, which was known as Standard Oil Company, or you could simply attempt to compete against John D. Rockefeller and either experience success or face ruin. Now, she's 14 years of age. She doesn't understand it at the time. She doesn't know what's going on, but she sees it through her daddy's eyes. And John D. Rockefeller, it must be stated that he told the individuals that he was trying to buy out, he said, if you come with me, you'll be rich. You will be wealthy. If you don't come with me, I'll make sure that you're bankrupt and broke. And her father knew how important it was for his business and how his life had been, booming because of what he had been doing, and he just didn't think it was right to sell out. And so he chooses not to go into partnership with Rockefeller, and actually what happens is he loses everything. John D. Rockefeller comes in, pretty much destroys in just 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, he's able to buy 22 of the 26 competitors that were in Cleveland, and one of the 26 that didn't go in, of course, was Ida Tarbell's father. And he resisted. He continued to produce independently, but it proves to be a disastrous result. Not only does Franklin Tarbell, Ida's dad, basically have to mortgage the house and have to go through a lot of other things, but his partner actually kills himself because of what John D. Rockefeller was doing. And it's at that moment that you see Ida Tarbell has this most major turning point of her career, because she really wanted to be a science teacher. And then after seeing what her daddy had gone through, she decides, as you mentioned, to go to the school in Allegheny and actually turn into journalism.
Yeah, and this whole thing, what Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company was doing, what you mentioned as the Cleveland Massacre, it was really underhanded. It was immoral, and probably, maybe not at the time, but definitely today, it would be illegal. You mentioned that 21 of the 26 Cleveland, Ohio refineries were purchased in a very short period of time, but 6 of those 21 went down in a 48-hour period. I mean, this was just literally a business massacre. I mean, you had the Standard Oil Company that had plenty of money. It was a huge operation, tanker cars and barrel making facilities and warehouses and boats, and they had, as we're going to talk about in a minute, they had special deals with these train companies that was very important in these places, and they just come in and they're able to just do things that these smaller companies could. So, for example, they go to these smaller refinery companies and offer special deals. So or they get special deals. So Rockefeller is literally going and buying these refineries below what we may call as market value, and he's just sweeping up the competition, just enhancing his status as not just simply an oil tycoon, but literally a monopoly in the oil business. And he is just going to absolutely devastate those smaller refineries. Almost reminds me, Chris, today of Walmart.
Yeah.
You get a super Walmart move into a small town, and what does it do to the mom and pop shops?
Yeah, they just declined. And I think it needs to be said, about John Rockefeller. I mean, he was born into poverty.
Yeah.
And John Rockefeller understood the importance of saving and investing money. And, he had this desire that he was going to be wealthy. He said when he was a young boy, he said, quote, "Someday, sometime when I am a man, I want to be worth $100,000. And then he said, "And I'm going to be." So he was very confident. And I think you see that in his business dealings. And Ida Tarbell, as you mentioned, she goes to college and she realizes that writing is good, but the very best way that she can finance her career is by going overseas. And so she'll go overseas, and as you mentioned, she writes a very well-known essay, if you will, or I think it was like a 20-part series in the magazine on Lincoln. She writes a very nice one on Napoleon Bonaparte, and McClure sees that his circulation begins to double, and she then says, "All right, it's time for me to set my sights on this Standard Oil Company." And her dad said, "Ida, don't do this. John Rockefeller will destroy you. He will come after you with everything that you have." But she was a determined young lady, and she said, "This is important, not just of what he did for my family, but it's important that the world know what these robber barons, if you will, these capitalists are trying to do." And so she takes on John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company, and she is willing to go out there and just do her research, painstaking research, to uncover all that was going on with Standard Oil Company.
Yeah, and it's in 1900 that she really looks back over the past 3 decades and starts looking at what's happened and what Rockefeller has done, and she starts doing a lot of research. And it's interestingly that she started her research with one of her father's I guess, small town refinery people, a guy called Henry Rogers, who, of course, had gotten on with Rockefeller after Rockefeller had purchased his company and all that kind of thing. And he worked very close with Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. And she goes in and she interviews him for the McClure's magazine articles. And he just brags to her. He talks about what they did. He gives her information, who did what, how they did it, all this kind of stuff. And it's very interesting. He continues talking to her, and he talks to her for several years, I think about 2 years. And then when he finally figures out what's going on, she said his face went white with rage.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that he was the one that reached out to Ida Tarbell?
Yeah.
That he actually reached out through an intermediary, who, by the way, was a man by the name of Mark Twain, and said, "Hey, could you connect us together?" And Mark Twain connects Ida Tarbell and Henry Rogers together. And the reason that he reached out to her is because he had read her writings that she did on Lincoln, and it was such a flattering piece on Lincoln that he thought she was going to write this flattering piece on him. And he kept coming back and saying, "Oh, let me tell you this, and let me tell you that." And I mean, he was feeding her the inward operations of the business, and she's just documenting it, and and she's just absorbing everything without really, I mean, she didn't lie. She wasn't deceiving him. He was just very willing to express all that was going on. And so when all of a sudden he finds out that it's not as flattering as it was going to be, he becomes, as you mentioned, extremely upset and was like, "Where did you get all of that stuff?" And it's like,
and he claims she's all wrong. She's made all this stuff up. I mean, he goes ballistic on this poor woman. But I think she had everything she needed by that particular point. But you know what? And when you look at the book, when you look at her work, The History of the Standard Oil Company, it's very detailed. It gets into the inner workings of Rockefeller's business, his oil business, and all of that. But she does 2 things. Number one, I think she's very careful, not to libel Rockefeller personally, number one. And number 2, she doesn't go after capitalism itself. I mean, she does talk about how smart Rockefeller was, how capable he was, what a good businessman he was. But on the other hand, she's very clear that some of his business tactics were underhanded, they were unethical, they were immoral. And she doesn't, like I said, she doesn't really go after capitalism. I mean, I think her concern is more this kind of underhanded capitalism than capitalism itself.
And I think it's interesting that she was a journalist, which looks a whole lot different back then as it does today.
Right.
Because in her understanding, a journalist was just the facts.
Mm-hmm.
She was honest. She said, I will say this about Mr. Rockefeller. One of his most impressive characteristics is he's a patient guy. Mm-hmm. And that he lets things come to him. He builds it up. But, she didn't just go out saying, I'm going to get you back for what you did to my family. She's not all about that. She's just investigating, researching, studying, and writing an honest essay exposing what had happened. But I find it interesting that she had found out that, she had done all this research on Rockefeller, but she had never really seen the guy. Mm. She didn't know him.
Right.
But she found out that he was going to be at the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in Cleveland in October of 1903, and he was giving a talk to a Sunday school class at the church. And she said, well, I want to see the guy. I want to see everything, what does he look like? What's going on? So she actually goes to the meeting and wanted to get a look at him. And she describes that when she first saw him for the very first time, she said these words, quote, "We were sitting meekly at one side when I was suddenly aware of a striking figure standing in the doorway. There was an awful age in his face, the oldest man I had ever seen. But what power! Clearly and utterly sincere he was. He meant what he was saying." She also said that it was plain that he and not the minister was the pivot on which that audience swung that day. So I think in that brief moment when she saw him, it allowed her to say, I see him for exactly who he is, but also, right, there might be something there. She said that he was the oldest man that she had ever seen. Mm-hmm. So money doesn't always buy you happess, I guess, either, does it?
No, and at one point she actually calls him a living mummy, which is not a term of endearment, I don't think.
No.
But her work really opens the door on companies like the Standard Oil Company. The public is outraged at what they see here. Here you have this monopoly, this giant, and I think in one artist rendering the Standard Oil Company's pictured to be like an octopus with all these many arms going out. But her expose, this 2-part book, these articles she wrote, is actually credited with sort of breaking up the Standard Oil Company. And of course you had the U.S. Supreme Court that ruled against them in 1911, that they were violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. And ultimately it's going to be broken up. Now there are parts, Chris, of the Standard Oil Company that are still with us today. ExxonMobil,
yes,
Chevron. Mm-hmm. These companies are, they're, I guess you could say, descendants from the breakup of the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company.
And you have to go back, once again, I go back to Rockefeller. Here's this young lady who is writing all of these things about Rockefeller. I mean, just pretty much throwing his company to the wolves. She is, exposing all of his inward dealings. And Rockefeller, you would have thought he would have responded. You would have thought that he would have gone after her. He would have used his money, his influence, that he would have said, I'm going to silence you. But Rockefeller refuses to meet her. He actually doesn't even call her by a real name. He calls her Miss Tarbell. Mm-hmm. He just trying in a form of intimidation. And somebody asked him and said, why don't you respond to all that she is saying? And he said, not a word about that misguided woman. But he went a little further, and I thought this was interesting. When he was saying, don't speak about her, don't talk to her, he said this. He pointed to a worm that was on the ground. And he said, if I step on that worm, I'll call attention to it. But if I ignore it, it will just disappear. So I think that Rockefeller was thinking, she's a nobody, she's writing in a magazine, nobody's really going to pay attention to her when they look at me, the wealthiest guy in the world just about. If I let her be, it will die away. And oh, how wrong he was.
How wrong he was. He also referred to her as that poisonous woman. He didn't have anything good to say about her, though he, like you said, he didn't really say much publicly about her. He actually told his employees and those in power in the company not to say anything about her. He just didn't, like you said, Chris, he just didn't think she was worth the time of day. But of course, she really was, because she changed his life and the company and American business at that particular time.
Yeah, she's known as one of the 12 greatest American women. That's
and her book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was at number 5 on the top 100 works of the 20th century American journalism. So this is still considered a very important work by Ida Tarbell. Yeah, thank you. By Ida Tarbell. Now, she's going to live until 1944, and she's going to live at the ripe old age of 86 when she's going to pass away. But, Chris, what a life this woman lived. And who would have guessed? Small log cabin, Pennsylvania. That's where she started. Like you said, wanted to be a science teacher, and she changed the nation.
Yeah, there's an interesting story that talks about her before her death. A young history professor asked her and said, if you could rewrite your book today, what would you change? And she said, not one word, young man. Not one word. A woman who had confidence, a woman who did not brag about it, but a woman who stood up for what she believed was right.
Yeah, what an amazing woman. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook. You can also find us on Sounder FM and Spotify. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.